friend of mine had just sent me the link to Sam Harris's latest, entitled Insurrection of Lies, and it is an impassioned critique of the woeful state of discourse currently being exhibited in his country, the United States of America. And although I'm generally an admirer of Harris, his passion, or rather his particular loathing of Trump, has unbalanced his critical compass. Harris is, of course, perhaps the most notable sufferer of TDS, or Trump derangement syndrome, and even he jokingly acknowledges this at times. But he makes the mistake, as many of us do, of speaking whilst in the full throes of that passion. This is a constant problem, since one likes to be topical. But the downside is that even for an intellect as prodigious as Harris's, insufficient time has elapsed for one to be truly analytical about the events, and the true nature of many of the details have yet to be revealed. Harris called it an insurrection, although seeks to damn that description further by saying that it had none of the gravitas of a real insurrection. So was it an insurrection or not? Despite the obvious drama of the images of the little people supposedly trespassing into the seat of government, a ragtag bunch of protesters cannot seriously be considered an insurrection. He says that those people, some of them grandmothers and civil senior citizens, as well as Confederate flag wavers and Davy Crockett lookalikes, were deranged by the lies of the president, whom he appears to hold responsible. Maybe they have been, and maybe the president is responsible. Maybe. Sure, he encouraged people to protest, but despite the much edited reports of his incitement, he did put in the caveat to protest peacefully. Perhaps, to use one of the left's favourite euphemisms, the storming of the Capitol was mostly peaceful, with only 5 people having been killed. 2 heart attacks, 1 who died of his injuries having been trampled underfoot, a 35-year-old female who was shot in the neck, and a 42-year-old policeman who was beaten with a fire extinguisher. As Harris acknowledges, it could have been very different, and as with the countless riots in Minneapolis, Portland, Seattle, Kenosha and elsewhere, it was only because of the restraint of the police force and other armed officials that it wasn't very, very much worse. Not that they'll get any credit for it, of course. And I suppose we'll never really know just how much of a knife edge it all was, mostly because of what didn't happen, rather than what did. And this is the great unknown. It could be said that the reason why the world is in the position it is now is because East German border guards made the decision not to gun down their compatriots on the 9th of November 1989. They didn't, and the 28-year-old Berlin Wall crumbled overnight. The countries of the former Soviet bloc came blinking into the light and followed suit in pretty short order in the following weeks and months. Germany was reunified. The Soviet Union collapsed, with communism having supposedly been publicly defeated, and the capitalist West, having been released from its burden of appearing better than communism, went on a 3 decades long orgy of consumerism, which had the effect of hollowing out their economies and reversing half a century of increasing prosperity for all, in favour of creating a new category of the super rich. And that was partly done by outsourcing all the heavy lifting of industrial mass production to a country which took another path. Because 7 months previously, on April the 15th, the soldiers of China's People's Liberation Army decided that they would, in fact, machine gun their compatriots in Tiananmen Square. Nobody knows how many died, but it is thought to be in the high thousands, and maybe even more than that. And still nobody knows what happened to Tank Man. So what's the takeaway from this? Are we to conclude that in the long run, brutal and murderous repression is better than limp-wristed restraint? It certainly worked for China, or at least it worked well for the Chinese Communist Party. And as Harris points out, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin will certainly be using the events in Washington to argue to their own citizens about the weakness of liberal democracy and that the West's moral superiority is misplaced. America, they will claim, is not only morally bankrupt, but it's also weak. Are they right? Are they? Are America's best days behind her? Tempting as it is to be among the first to announce the end of Pax Americana, what we may instead be witnessing is perhaps a developing maturity. Despite America's view of itself as a young country, still full of vigour and virginal beauty, the United States is no longer the spring chicken it once was. Although it remains a youngster compared to the ancient country it outgrew, it is in fact distinctly middle-aged. And with middle age comes an acceptance of one's own limitations. We're not as special as we once believed we were, or might become. At the age of 53, I know that I'm not going to be a millionaire, play guitar like Angus Young, power slide like Jim Clark, or play the role of Tyler Durden. And although I remain very, very pissed off about that, I'm also accepting. I'm not special. Although to a very small number of people I am. And I'm happy to say that seems as if I will always be. So in lots of ways, America is not special. From the heady days of the 50s when America was the richest and freest society the world had ever seen, for most of the population at least, the US probably leads the world in probably only half a dozen areas. Americans are no longer richer, cleverer or fitter than anybody else, as was once probably the case. But does that mean that America is finished? It might. It's possible. If the US does actually fracture and balkanise, then it will, by definition, be over. But if it can hold itself together, the death of the United States will be seen to have been an exaggeration. But holding itself together is not likely to be a walk in the park. Even more than 20 years ago, there was something I noticed about America that disturbed me. For it seemed to me, and as an outsider perhaps I was able to see it more clearly, that the people that 50% of Americans seem to despise more than anyone else was the other 50%. Now remember, this is years before Trump, before Obama, before the financial crisis, before social media, before the iPhone, and even before September the 11th. And I was slightly unnerved by this fissure even then, even when it was more of an intellectual observation by an interested foreigner, rather than the feeling of watching Rome fall as it is now. But one of the greatest things about America is the clue that it's in its name, the United States of America. That sense of a shared destiny. The old media was tearing chunks out of America's sense of brotherhood and cleaving it down the middle long before it became the raison d'etre of Twitter. Social media simply lifted the lid of the toilet seat. The shitter was already there, long before Jack Dorsey and Zuckerberg vomited into it. How has this happened? How is it that Americans so often view other Americans as their most implacable enemy, rather than just compatriots that they disagree with on a few issues? I'm not suggesting that Americans should start hunting around looking for other people they hate more, like Russians or Mexicans or Iranians or the Chinese or the French or Piers Morgan. In the Second World War, the Japanese were the enemy, and although there were still Democrats and Republicans and Conservatives and Liberal Americans that may have had profound differences on many issues, they were still Americans. But even then mistakes were made, since Americans descended from Japanese were considered Japanese, rather than the Americans, which is what they in effect were, and were cruelly interned. But in an actual war, this is perhaps understandable, albeit regrettable. But it's not like we in Britain haven't had a taste of this distinct polarity. The Brexit vote, being a binary choice, could not be resolved through compromise. It was yes or no, in or out, leave or remain. And although it is beginning to dissipate somewhat, partly as the Brexit reality becomes apparent, but mostly because any advantage or disadvantage has become purely academic, as our government continues to deliberately destroy our economy and civil society through the insanity of COVID totalitarianism. It seemed to be the blueprint of how to drive a wedge through the middle of a previously harmonious country. And as we witness the re-emergence of the Confederate flag being held by at least one of the protesters in the Capitol, and perhaps gives us a clue as to where the fractures might conceivably come in a breaking up of the United States by those determined to tear it apart, we also have our own domestic British version, although they'll hate me for describing them so. They are, of course, the SNP, or the Scottish Nazi Party, who are so consumed by their hatred of the English that they seem unable to do their day job of managing Scotland's affairs. The SNP do not have Britain's interests at heart. This is a given. But do those who fly the stars and bars care about what happens to the United States, or do they just hanker for the days of the Confederacy? I don't know, and forgive me if I'm missing something, but isn't the Confederate flag an enemy flag, if I understand it correctly? Surely if these people were patriots, shouldn't they be waving Old Glory? But even if they do want to destroy the United States, they are sadly not the only ones. It seems if there are elements in the left, the far left, BLM and Antifa who would like to see America fall. These are almost certainly people who have never even experienced anywhere outside of the US, let alone lived abroad, and so have not the slightest idea how much better life is within America than without. And I'm only talking homegrown America haters here. China is chomping at the bit to take America's #1 spot, and is technologically, though not quite yet militarily, capable of doing that. So America needs to watch its back. Hopefully, properly patriotic Americans in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force and the Marine Corps will be assessing the danger and assuring that America remains defended, whatever the divisive politics at home. But as important as defending America's borders with guns is, it will all count for naught if America implodes on itself. All the aircraft carriers, fighter planes, nuclear submarines and Abrams main battle tanks will not make a jot of difference in defending America if America is cleaved in two. Let's say, just for argument's sake, that Washington, Oregon, California and the liberal states of New England decide that they can no longer live with the deplorables of the flyover states and secede to form a new country. Let's call it the liberal states of America. What happens then? The Pacific Fleet of the former USA will now be under the control of the new regime, but the Atlantic Fleet, operating out of maybe Norfolk in Virginia, remains loyal to the remainder of the old US. The power of the undisputed #1 superpower will be cut in two. Like the alpha male gorilla that is brought down by two other males only 2/3 his size, the certainty and stability of Pax Americana might easily be extinguished by a super confident China and a resurgent Russia. When Chinese troops are entering San Francisco and shutting down decadent Google to make way for the much more reliable and obedient TikTok, the super rich elites of Silicon Valley might suddenly realise just how much they actually had in common with the machine tool workers of Cleveland or the corn growers of Iowa that they had spent so much of their time looking down their noses at as knuckle-dragging racists. And similarly, as the cyber attacks launched by Russia against military targets and strategic infrastructure in the south and the eastern seaboard seriously degrade America's technological capability, those Second Amendment advocates might also realise that having the software engineers of Boston or California that they had dismissed as commies, fags or degenerates on their side might have been a better idea than letting them drift away with their money and their technological genius. America will only survive if it remains the United States of America, if it remains true to its name, if it remains true to its founding principles. I've heard patriotism described as the narcissism of minor difference. And I think there's some truth in that. Take my country, Britain, and one of our closest neighbours, France. We've had over 1,000 years of rivalry that has erupted many times into outright conflict and wars, and we are in detail very different. We're a constitutional monarchy, they're a republic. We have a bottom-up tradition of English common law. They have a top-down Napoleonic system. They value intellectual conversation, whereas we tend to prefer the company of our dogs. They have the City of Light, whereas we have that thing that is surrounded by the M25 motorway. We had E-Type Jags, and they had Citroen 2CVs. But broadly speaking, despite these differences, we tend to agree on all the things that matter, officially at least. Freedom of speech, democracy, the rule of law. And it's taken some time for us to work these things out so that we can, generally speaking, be good neighbours to each other. And we're only neighbours, rather than compatriots. But somewhere along the way it seems that Americans have lost sight of what it means to call other Americans brother. Now, I don't know this beyond a shadow of a doubt, not being an American, and I don't wish to poke my British hooter into things that are technically none of my business. Maybe I should butt out. Maybe. But as a friend and an admirer of America, I feel it is my duty to point out things that maybe because you're so close to them you cannot clearly see yourself. And you are doing so well. As President Obama said in his inaugural address in 2009, that America had gone from a place where a black man and a white man could not sit at the same lunch counter, in some places, to a place where a majority white country had elected a black man as their president and commander-in-chief in just 50 years. That's barely 2 generations. Admittedly, a lot of water has passed under the bridge since then, but that is pretty damn impressive. And it's something to be proud of. But America has to rediscover that sense of national unity. And I'm not talking about the unity that Joe Biden is told to talk about. Not the unity of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who thinks that Trump supporters should be punished for supporting the wrong side. Not the unity of critical race theory, and not the unity of preparing COVID financial rescue packages for all businesses that are not run by white men. No, not that kind of unity. The real kind. The kind of unity that ordinary Americans display to one another all across the country, day after day. Luckily, and you are lucky to have this, luckily you have just the tool to do this. You have the Constitution and you have the Bill of Rights. We have a Bill of Rights too, but I kill to have yours. You have your freedom of speech enshrined in that document above all other rights. Use it. And you have your right to defend yourself. Defend that right. And do not listen to a word from condescending foreigners, and especially not Brits, telling you that the Second Amendment is outdated or unnecessary. It comes with a danger, sure, and that is evident, most notably and most tragically at the moment in Chicago. But the greater danger is in losing that right. Defend it with all your might. It might have been nice if any of you had used your Second Amendment rights to defend the Fourth Amendment, but we'll just gloss over that for the moment, shall we? However, coming from a country that has just abandoned pretty much all of its 8 centuries of liberty in a mere 10 months, I've hardly got room to talk. But the flame of liberty must be kept burning in the US. If you fall, we all do. Now Trump has lost, and even if you don't think he should have, that battle is over. After he banned critical race theory, I was gradually coming over to Trump, since I believe that I can see Biden and Harris for what they really are, But his failure to pardon Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, something that was completely within his power to do so, should alert you to realise that he wasn't the man he said he was. In those two simple acts, he could have done more to drain the swamp than any amount of legal cases about a rigged election. In Assange's case, it would have sent a signal to the deep state that they're not quite as deep as they imagined. But he didn't do that. He let them off the hook. You've got to wonder why he didn't do it, even just as a fuck you to the establishment that obviously hated him. Was it cowardice? Or more likely that he wasn't quite as keen as draining the swamp as we all hoped he was? But like I say, that ship has sailed. Trump, however, has done us all a service, whether he intended to or not. He demonstrated that an outsider could win. But having won, like our experience with Brexit, the establishment doesn't take defeat lying down. Just as our establishment spent 4 years trying every trick in the book, and some that weren't even in the book, to overturn the result, they very nearly succeeded. Some still say that they did. Time will tell, I guess. But unity, not as an empty slogan, but as a genuine impulse, is what is required of Americans. You must find things in common with those that you disagree with. The auto worker in Detroit must find common cause with the guy who sits in front of a screen in Wall Street. The Texan NRA member must find something on which to agree with the progressive liberal in Portland. I would venture to suggest that the way you do that is by adhering solidly and unwaveringly to America's principles. Compromise doesn't have to mean abandoning them. Freedom of speech for everyone. The rule of law to which everyone is accountable. And losers consent even when, and especially when, you lose. I can't tell you to like each other, but what I can tell you is that out of the 330 million Americans out there, there is no way in hell that 165 million of them are your enemy. They are your compatriots. They are Americans. Start treating them as such. After all, who else is going to watch your back?